Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I wanted to go back to an old favourite topic of the Ukraine war. And in particular I wanted to focus on a particular aspect that I do not think has been very well covered by the news media. And this is very much in line with the theme of this channel, which is talking about negotiations and how you shape negotiation. Now, why the media aren't covering this topic particularly well could be a couple of reasons. It could be ignorance, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, but also a desire not to have this kind of conversation openly because of some of the more controversial aspects to it. But I think it's important. I think that when discussing the Ukraine war, there have been lots of commentary that the end of this war will come about through a negotiated settlement rather than a sort of massive battlefield victory. And this is because as much as people might be rooting for Ukraine, the reality is Russia is a big country with lots of resources, with lots of people. If they really want to keep a war going for a very long time, they can. The issue is, do they have the will to do so? Now, of course, Ukraine also has to have the will to resist and to keep fighting all the way until the Russian troops are on the other side of the internationally recognized border. But achieving that is easier said than done. And impressive as the Ukraine military victories have been, there are definite limits. So this is why a lot of the commentators will say either there's a negotiated outcome or there's very much a protracted stroke frozen conflict. And that's about as far as the analysis is willing to go, because people don't appear willing to openly go further than that. Well, I don't have a particularly vested interest to defend here, and no one paying me for my opinion, so I can pretty much go ahead and say what I actually think are some of the core issues and why it's important for Ukraine to understand these issues if they want to achieve the best outcome for them in that potential future negotiated settlement. So let's delve into this. So as I like to do in these videos, I'm going to set the context a little bit. So we will start with a question. I always start with a question, don't I? Seems to be a bit of a habit I have. But there we go. So the question is, what has that lovely Mr. Putin been up to? Well, as we know, his initial military invasion failed fairly spectacularly. So, of course, the Kremlin had to redraw the goalposts, re-strategize, reprioritize the objectives, whatever the phrasing you want to use. But that's not necessarily been delivering sustained military success for them. In fact, quite the opposite had been true. So what Putin had resorted to doing is pretty much reverting to his personality type. What do I mean by that? Well, think of Putin as a bit like a sort of a mobster, a mafia don type thing. The way he works is he intimidates people. So either you turn up and you're subservient, you agree to everything he wants, you go away and do it, he's happy. That's sort of like stage one. If you are not doing what he wants or quite the timelines that he wants, then he'll put the frighteners on you. Nothing too severe. If you're still failing or even refusing to obey his command, and that's when he'll really go for the lashing out, the punishment side of his nature. So, family members might have accidents and fall out of windows and other such things. But he's very much accustomed to threatening people. That is his, the way he operates. We've seen that in the account of Boris Johnson when he testified in front of a select committee, and that Putin told him to do what he wanted, otherwise, he might hurt him. And that is literally classic mobster type territory, and that is Putin mentality. That is how the KGB used to operate, I suppose. And I suppose he carried that on with him. So we're looking at the Ukraine war. The Ukrainians are not giving Putin what he wants. So he is trying to find ways of applying leverage to them. And he's going about this in a way that aligned with how he does his normal business, one guesses. So obviously lots of various strikes, various things in Ukraine get clobbered, and then they start clobbering civilian stuff, theatres and hospitals. Then he switches strategy to trying to clobber the energy grid in the run up to winter. Because in Putin's mind, what is he doing? He is realizing that militarily he is not going to get what he wants. And he keeps firing generals, but that doesn't actually change the outcome. So what he is trying to do is basically pressurize and blackmail the Ukrainians into coming into the negotiation table and agreeing to his conditions, which one presumed will be, fake denazification, probably freezing the borders where they currently are. That's the best case of outcome for him, so on and so forth. But of course, Ukraine are not doing that. They're not agreeing to come to the negotiation table under these conditions. So Putin needs to reach out a bit further. So what does he think of doing? Well, not only does he just broaden his target set within Ukraine to really try and put the screws on them, he then tries to think of, okay, well, how do I go after those who are backing Ukraine? And so his initial play was to create an energy crisis for Europe. Now that didn't work either. So all he can resort to doing is making lots of threats. The nuclear threat, the escalation threat, and so on. And he's not really aiming them at Ukraine per se, he's actually aiming it more at Ukraine's allies, particularly Europe, because he's trying to intimidate into scaring them into drawing down their support. Now, to a certain degree, this has been successful. Ukraine's allies have not been willing to go all out in the weapon supplies, long-range weapons, combat jets, etc. However, and as the commentators have been saying, they've very much been stepping up the escalation ladder, I believe is what they call it. So bit by bit, they apply more pressure onto Putin in return. So obviously there's the sanctions. And there's lots of to and fro on sanctions. The Russians obviously trying to bust the sanctions, and the West are trying to make them more effective. I'll perhaps do a video about that another time. But more in the meantime, this particular bit is that Ukraine are getting better and better weaponry. And a more recent announcement is that, for example, the UK are going to give them Storm Shadow, which will give them long-range precision capability. However, there's a widely held belief that Ukraine will only be allowed to use those within Ukrainian territory and not to hit Russian targets. But that, of course, restriction does not apply to Russia. Now, Russia has not dared go outside of the borders of Ukraine and hit, targets in Poland, for example, at least not deliberately, or anywhere else in NATO. So at this point, Putin is trying to, having failed to properly intimidate Ukraine, he is just trying to make life as miserable to them as possible in order to improve his negotiation position. But he knows, or he has suddenly realised, that the biggest problem he has is alliances. Ukraine has allies, Russia really doesn't, or very limited in the way of, allied support. So he's trying to leverage that in as many ways as possible. He's trying to scare off Ukraine's allies whilst bolstering his own. So there's lots of Russian activity going on in Africa, for example, or in India and in China, because of course he needs their support and he needs the revenue to help fund the war machine. So that's the context, that's kind of the scenario, and it's worth bearing this in mind as we look at some of the other bits. Now, in a military context, Ukraine has lots of problems. The types of equipment, numbers of trained people, the fact that a whole bunch of missiles keep landing in and trashing their facilities, whether military or civilian. Just hitting a power plant or factory does degrade Ukrainian capability, in the long term. So Ukraine has all those issues, but as a general rule, they are being solved or mitigated to a certain extent. So, for example, the Russians might hit, a tank factory in Ukraine, but they cannot hit the tank factory in Germany. And as a lot of the tanks are coming from German factories, essentially, by various roundabout routes, then that helps to safeguard Ukrainian war production, shall we say. So that's so those various problems are, with the help of alliances, money and all the other things, are being solved, or at least the impact being reduced. But there's one problem that isn't being solved. You see, Ukraine is not able to do the same to Russia. So let's think about this in a normal, if anything such word exists, but in a normal war context. If two big nations go to war against each other, not only do they hit each other, or they fire against military targets on the battlefield, but they start to go after targets well behind the front line. So take World War II as a classic example. It was very much the belief on either side that you went and clobbered the cities, you clobbered the factories in order to degrade the ability of that nation to continue the fight, or to make it a lot harder for them to resupply the front line. And Russia has been attempting to do that, but it's been a bit limited in a sense. But Ukraine is not able to reciprocate that to Russia. So think of this in a military context. Ukraine has got to bash its way through all those Russian defensive lines, all those guns, all the artillery, all the missiles and so on. But what they're not able to do, due to military capability, but also because of political will, they're not able to go and hit Russian factories all the way back in Moscow or Siberia or whatever. And that's kind of important. That's a big problem for Ukraine. Not only in a military sense, but also in a negotiation sense as well. Because if they want to win this war, they want to restore the borders back to where it should be, then they need to degrade the ability of the Russians to actually fight for that border. And they obviously are struggling. They're having quite a degree of success, but they would have more success if Russian logistics got even more hampered, Russian manufacturing went even more down the toilet. Now, sanctions to a certain degree are helping with this, but sanctions are very much a slow process. And no doubt if you were a Ukrainian president, you would like to speed things on a little bit. And of course, this would make Putin more desperate. And Putin knows this. This is why Putin had made quite severe threats, or lots of bluster, I should say. Because he knows that if the Western powers supported Ukraine in going after Russian infrastructure, Russian munition factory, then his military position gets even weaker. And his ability to negotiate a freezing of, on the current line of contact would reduce. Because, of course, everybody would know that the Russian military would barely be able to hold that line because they're not getting enough supplies. So this turns me to a little bit of the things like what's going on in Belgorod, the recent news, where a force, and there's lots of murkiness about this, went into the region of Belgorod and started causing chaos there. Now that's a bit of an interesting marker, because that perhaps is Ukraine via proxy attempting to slightly address that particular problem. However, that doesn't go anywhere near close enough. As a short story, really, if the Russians have impunity to strike at any target in Ukraine, because there isn't that much comeback on them in the short term, whereas Ukraine is being hobbled from being able to return the favour to Russia, or they can only do so via more clandestine means. So what does that mean in terms of the negotiation? And that's the part I want to explore next. Now, we've heard a phrase used quite a lot recently, which is shaping the battlefield. And that is, analysts seem to be thinking that is what Ukraine is doing as a precursor to their offensive. And funnily enough, this is a similar concept in negotiation. You could say shaping negotiation, or you could say preconditioning. That's perhaps more of a standard phrase that I use. But pretty much the consequences are the same. If we assume that Ukraine will at some point have to reach some kind of settlement with Russia, then they want to do so on the most favourable terms to them. Now, just like they are doing with trying to, launch their counter-offensive, they're trying to create the battlefield situation most favourable to their forces. So they're going to be hitting logistics, they're going to be hitting ammo dumps, and so on. In a negotiation sense, they can't, not only do they need to do that to improve their military position, but they also need to degrade the Russian economic position. So what do I mean by that? Well, obviously there's the military economic side of it. If you hit a Russian tank factory, if you hit a Russian munitions factory, then that forces Putin to the negotiation table, in theory, more willing to concede. Obviously, Putin's a bit of a bully for negotiation, but even in that sort of scenario, that does not necessarily mean he will ever compromise on anything. He may go, down swinging, basically. But the context is that Ukraine need to take away Russia's ability to fight to improve their negotiation position. But there's more to that. And this part's a little bit more controversial. And this is the part that the Western Alliance and the media don't want to talk about. You see, Putin, as I pointed out earlier, is acting like a mafia don. He just wants to make the pain so severe that the other side acquiesces to his demand. Well, Ukraine needs to start thinking, really, about doing the same to Russia. Now, sanctions will be having an impact. But let's think about how the Russian economy works. Basically, and especially in a post-sanction sort of world, all its revenue is generated by oil and gas. If you take away Russian manufacturing and if you take away Russian revenue from oil and gas, what is left? And the answer, of course, is pretty much an economic disaster for Russia. Now, that economic disaster may come in time, but for now, Putin is still able to fund his war machine by selling oil and gas to India and China. So if I was Ukraine, I'd want to take that away from him. What does that mean? That might mean not necessarily using military long-range missiles or ballistic missiles, because of course Ukraine does not have those, but perhaps using their special forces component, going to those oil pipelines and oil fields in Siberia and blowing a lot of things up. So blowing up the refineries, blowing up the oil pipes, and basically starving Russia economically. Why has Russia, and I've got a bit into an interesting question here, why has Ukraine not already been doing this? And my thesis on this is that is because we all know that the world is very dependent upon oil and gas. So, and Russia, of course, is a major, one of the top two, I think, isn't it, oil and gas producer in the world. So if you cut off those supplies to the world, then a whole host of economic shocks will start to happen. So this is the problem, really, that Ukraine has. They need to shape the negotiation by turning the screws back on Putin. And they could do that by taking away his oil and gas revenues. I'm sure it is technically feasible for them to go and do that, to cause a huge amount of economic damage to Russia as part of the negotiation strategy. But I suspect that they're having to walk a very delicate tightrope here, that the nation supporting them absolutely does not want them doing that because of the more global economic consequences that would result. Now, we're not talking about the fact that Russia and India and China would not be able to buy their oil and gas so cheaply anymore. They would just buy from the Middle East just like everybody else. But what would happen would be a global increase in prices. And 2022 pretty much demonstrated what that looks like and the impact that that can have across the globe. This is the power that Ukraine currently has that no one wants to talk about. They could literally cause a massive economic shock by just denuding Russia of its, of its levers, of its ability to sell, to make income. And if they did that, that would significantly strengthen their negotiation, but it would also come at a significant cost to others. And so this is a delicate balance that they have to strike. And it's a really interesting scenario that Ukraine has not done this, or maybe I should say not done this yet. So in terms of concluding this video, I would leave with these thoughts that war is not solely a contest of military might. Politics and economics play a significant role as well. And right now Ukraine is winning the military war, and to a certain extent, quite a significant extent perhaps, is winning the politics war. But they are not winning the economics war, at least not yet, although they do have significant NATO backing. They have the means, I'm pretty sure, of creating some fairly significant economic impacts to Russia. But doing so comes at a significant risk, political risk, shall we say, to them. And maybe military risk as well, if that means that nations start withdrawing their military support. So it's an interesting balancing act for them. They need to win that war. They need to shape the negotiation in their favour as much as possible, but they're not being allowed to. So this is the question. What is escalation? Putin has escalated as far as he can go, and trouble is his escalation in many ways lacks credibility. And I talk about this a lot in the negotiation context, that any escalation needs to be considered and it needs to be credible. Too many people will just escalate without much thought. And Putin kind of has done that, and that's all backfired on him. Ukraine has not particularly escalated, and they've made quite a lot of effort not to do so, and that's pretty blatant. There's lots more they could do, for example, firing across the Russian border to take out various military targets, and they've been extremely limited in doing that. So they have feared to escalate too much. But there's going to come a point when Ukraine at the moment are dependent upon their allies to do the escalation, for example via sanctions. But there's going to come a point where they will perhaps want to take more personal control, to escalate themselves. Now, escalation comes in various forms. It doesn't just have to be an aggressive, direct action. They could, if they were able to, for example, take away the few friends that Russia has. And currently India and China are top of that list. So if Ukraine was, via one means or another, able to persuade China to completely withdraw its support for Russia, that would be an effective escalation. But of course, how Ukraine does that, I do not know. And it's important to think of this concept of escalation because it's used to improve your negotiation position. And this is something that hadn't been talked about, but at some point Ukraine is going to need to think about it, because unless Ukraine are able to be totally militarily successful, they're going to have to negotiate with Putin, distasteful as that thought might be. So it'll be interesting to see where they go with this one and what happens next. It may well be that the Russian strategy has run out of escalation and they're down to waiting for the next US presidential election in the hope that the winds of change will be more in their favour. And that may also be a driver to Ukraine to speed things up by various means, for example, blowing up pipelines. So that's my little thesis in this particular video, that it's been very interesting to compare what has and what has not worked in the escalation context of the Ukraine war. And it's an interesting lesson as well. I talk about stakeholder management in negotiation terms. Ukraine has done a lot of that. Ukraine, under President Zelensky, had worked incredibly hard. But perhaps, and this is always a theme for anyone involved in negotiations, your allies or your stakeholders never quite go where you want them to go fast enough. And no doubt that is how Zelensky feels. He's not being able to militarily escalate as fast enough as he has been able to. Politically, he's done pretty well, and the Allies have done fairly well on that, so that's been a bit more of a success story. But economically, not quite there yet. And does he push that button? Does he try to persuade his allies to really ratchet up the pressure? Only time will tell. So I hope you found that video interesting, and please do like, please do subscribe, and I look forward to seeing any comments in the box below.